proud to be black. And I'm proud to be in Canada being black. I'm proud to be in America being black. But I am afraid in both.
As the United States and communities around the world continue to stand up against racism following the unjust death of George Floyd at the hands of law enforcement, one former NFL player currently living in Winnipeg says patting yourself on the back as a Canadian for being a little less racist isn't something to cheer about.
This is what I live. Regardless if I'm in Canada, when you go somewhere to enjoy yourself or walk amongst people, you feel afraid. And how do I explain racism to my daughter? How do I explain hate to my daughter?
Butler, who played in the NFL with the Detroit Lions and Cleveland Browns before finishing his career with the CFL's Blue Bombers, says being a professional athlete has not insulated him from racism.
My major frustration is done having to justify being black for somebody else's acts of hate.
Butler, who grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, has seen his fair share of racism and heartbreak. He lost his mother at the age of 10 to a violent street murder, and memories of his painful past are triggered when he sees violence breaking out. While he now calls Winnipeg home, he worries about what could follow in other countries if we don't address systemic racism and discrimination in every way, shape, and form.
So it has to be said, and it has to be said just like this. How bad do you want to make a change? You talk about it, but let's write it down. Let's put some money behind it, and let's really see this thing grow, because we see how big hate is.
Kelly Butler recently became a father. He says conversations with your little girl about how the world is different for black kids than white kids because of the color of their skin isn't a discussion that should have to take place in 2020. But it does.
That's the frustration. Then as a dad, I ask myself, what do I tell my daughter? Be afraid of being who you are because the color of your skin?
Butler now works with Indigenous children in Winnipeg and wants to have frank discussions with those standing as allies with people of color who don't face discrimination on a daily basis.
That uncomfortable that you're feeling as a friend, an ally, a person that's not an African American or black, understand if you really want to be a part of this, then you're going to have to be a part of this for a little bit longer than a day, because we seem to keep forgetting that black people keep dying.
In Winnipeg, Mark Neufeld, City News.
More on our poll now on racism in Canada. Almost 2/3 of Canadians believe that discrimination is common in Canada today. When asked, does discrimination happen in Canada today, 28% said frequently, 37% said quite often, and 33% said from time to time. And according to our poll, Canadians agree, with 29% certain there is and 32% saying they are pretty sure. Our poll also asked Canadians which groups are most likely to suffer discrimination, with 97% of Canadians saying Muslims suffer some level of discrimination, 95% of Canadians saying black people suffer some discrimination, with 95% agreeing refugees suffering discrimination, and 94% agreeing that Indigenous people are targets as well. Those same questions were asked just 4 years ago, and believe it or not, the numbers are up. Let me give you an example. Those thinking that black people face a lot of discrimination, that's up by 9%. Those who think Indigenous people face a lot of discrimination, that's up 7%.
We're talking about how anti-black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and other forms of racism are actually embedded in our government and in all of the institutions that our Canadian government allows to exist.
Political leaders across Canada have rushed to condemn systemic racism in the aftermath of protests condemning the way Canada governs and polices marginalized populations. But activists warn that without understanding what systemic racism is, the people at the very heads of those systems are just talking the talk without walking the walk.
We don't have a Canada without the Indian Act. We don't have a Canada without residential schools or the reservation system. We don't have a Canada without slavery and segregation and all of the things that those produced.
Akwasi Owusu-Bempah says systemic or structural racism is baked into Canada's history. Systems developed during the colonial era colored who had access to education, who could gain wealth, and who could hold political power. Those systems continue to have lasting impacts with results that are still felt today.
Things like school disciplinary practices, the ideas and beliefs that were propagated and shared during those times influence how teachers perceive children's behavior. They influence how employers perceive the potential intelligence or work ethic of job applicants, and they influence how, organizations that I study, like the police, decide who they're going to stop and search.
Today, black women are one of the fastest growing Canadian prison populations, despite making up a fraction of the population. And the Conference Board of Canada reports black Canadians earn only 80 cents for every dollar white Canadians earn. Author and activist Desmond Cole says while the Prime Minister has talked a lot about systemic racism, his government has sued to stop a Human Rights Tribunal ruling on funding for Indigenous children in care.
The Human Rights Tribunal has said exactly what I just said. This is racist. It's not fair to give First Nations kids on reserves less money, and the government has to immediately equalize the funding. What has Justin Trudeau been doing instead? He has been fighting First Nations people in court so that he doesn't have to equalize the funding.
Now, Cole was able to provide a long list of examples of Canada failing to address systemic racism or indeed benefiting from it, most recently failing to obtain the consent of the Wet'suwet'en people before attempting to build the Coastal GasLink pipeline through unceded territory. In Ottawa, Xiaoli Li, City News.
All right, let's get into it. Joining us right now, Sheila North, former Grand Chief and Indigenous advocate, Idil Issa, Fondation Parole de Femmes, and Michael Bach, Center for Diversity and Inclusion. Welcome to our show. Sheila, I'm going to start with you. Let's talk about systemic racism. How does it work for whoever doesn't get it yet?
Well, I think you had a really good explainer there, and I think what people need to know is just look around you and see who is working in some of the prestigious jobs in Canada, like even pilots or even in the RCMP, or perceived prestigious, I suppose. These kind of professions require higher education and usually a lot of backing of money to be on hand to be able to study and to get necessary hours to complete those kind of achievements. And we don't have that afforded to people of color in this country, especially Indigenous people. We don't have access to good education systems to begin with. And then we don't have access to funds to keep us going for 7-8 years or however long it takes to get a pilot's license or to get a lawyer's license. And so these kind of challenges are inhibiting people from participating in the economy and being self-sufficient. So that's just one example. And we see this also in other systems like the RCMP and like the other justice systems and health. And we know that, you know, we're not saying that everyone in these systems are racist. The policies that drive them are racist, and the people that follow them sometimes, even though they're not racist, end up doing racist actions because they're following policy that's been set for them ahead of time.
Good explanation there. Donnovan.
Michael, I want to bring you into the conversation because it's important for white people to be a part of the conversation. So we know exactly what we're talking about. What is white privilege? How does it manifest itself? And what are the consequences?
Yeah, so privilege as a concept is essentially social advantages or benefits that an individual gains as a consequence of being part of a particular group. So as an example, you could have wealth privilege if you're extremely wealthy. White privilege is exactly what then it sounds like, and that is privilege as a consequence of being a person who is Caucasian. So I have white privilege, meaning that I've never been followed by police thinking that I couldn't afford the car I was driving. I've never been followed around a store because people thought I was going to steal something. And that is a privilege that I gain simply by birth, and it is assigned to me by society. Privilege is not something that you can get rid of. It's not something that you can gain by yourself. It has to be assigned to you. And it manifests the way we've been seeing it, where people then start to believe that they are somehow better than another person because of their privilege.
Okay, that is a good explanation there, Michael. Thank you for that. I'm going to go over to Idil now, who is in Montreal, where the government has actually said there is no systemic racism. So I want to ask you, how important is it for Canadians to acknowledge that racism actually exists in this country?
Well, it's mission critical for Canadians to begin to confront racism here in Canada. The death of George Floyd has been a catalyst, a global catalyst for a reckoning with racism, which permeates America, but also Canada. Just as you mentioned, just this week, Premier Legault claimed that there's no systemic racism, and that's in a province where they passed Bill 21. And Stockwell Day, in a panel on CBC, said that racism was similar to getting teased for wearing eyeglasses. So we really need to move beyond denial here in Canada, and we need to recognize that there's serious issues. There's racial profiling. There's issues with access to affordable housing and job opportunities. There's the criminalization of Black and Indigenous people in Canada, and these are very serious issues. And we also need to stop comparing. We shouldn't compare the plight of Black people to any other people. We shouldn't, play this type of comparison game. We really need to move beyond that and show leadership in taking on this problem in Canada.
When it comes to this whole idea of racism existing and folks just not wanting to step into that space, I just want to call attention to Amy Cooper, who in Central Park basically called out hysterically to police because an African-American man asked her nicely to put her dog on a leash. And after all of the hysteria, she said she is not racist. And with that, I want to give it back to Donnovan, because I know you want to talk to Michael a little bit about how the Amy Coopers of the world can actually use their privilege a bit differently. Yeah, let's follow that thread line, because if we use Amy Cooper as an example, Michael, she used her privilege as a bit of a shield, but she also weaponized the Blackness of Christian Cooper in that moment. So how can people watching this do the opposite? Use their privilege maybe to help in this conversation?
Yeah, so first and foremost, you have to acknowledge that you have privilege, that it does exist, and it's not something you can simply deny. Second is to avoid as much as possible the sort of white savior complex where we are sweeping in to save the poor Black people. That has not gone well in the past, and we have lots of examples of it. So really, it's about me as a white person saying to Idil, as an example, how can I help? What can I do to be a part of this conversation? I really want to see racism dismantled, and from a systemic perspective, what's the role that I can play? It's not a matter of me being the savior. It's a matter of me lending my voice to a very, very important cause.
So I'm going to go back to Sheila now for a moment then, because we're hearing then, if you're in that space, if you're in that white space, you have the power to be able to change things. Who else needs to be responsible for making sure that we actually start to put an end to the mess we're in right now? Sheila, who do you think? Where do we start?
Well, I think we have to start letting Indigenous people into the room, into the tables that are where decisions are being made, because we don't see that. We don't see that in any aspect. It's very, very minimal. And we talk about wanting inclusion and diversity on many levels, but then we don't do it. We do it a little bit, and then we back off. And then, when we talk in the media as well, we look across the board. We see mostly white faces, mostly a lot of white males, and then a lot of females as well. But we don't see the true picture of what Canada is and the diversity and the beauty of Indigenous people. So it's very obvious in a lot of ways, and then at the same time, people don't want to acknowledge it. So then when they don't acknowledge it, then it doesn't exist to them. So it's a simple but also complex situation that we're in.
Lots of work to do. Thank you to all three of our guests. We're headed to break now. We will be back. Stay with us.
Sport has the power to change the world It has the power to unite people.
Blackberry molasses, one of the things that never change. You gotta keep pushing on, the sun don't rain all the time. There's gonna be some heartache and pain.
Desmond, what a time for you to be alive. In the first year of your life, you've already seen the Raptors win an NBA championship, a global pandemic, and a race revolution. That's right, revolution. I pray for your sake this is a movement and not just a moment, because people who don't look like you and I are starting to care. A man by the name of George Floyd had his life stolen from him, screaming for help longer than it will take for you to read this letter. We've had so many moments before, and sports has often been the catalyst for change. Donnovan Bailey winning gold was the first time I felt Canadian pride, the first time I saw black excellence. But even when he brought up race, he was criticized. The first time I saw a black man celebrated on TV was Ben Johnson. When he won, he was Canadian. But when it was revealed he didn't exactly follow the rules, he was described as a Jamaican immigrant. From that moment I knew the color of your skin colors how people treat you, and that you can't afford to make a mistake. That's not fair, but our life's not fair. You might have to let your ability speak volumes like Jesse Owens. You'll often have to wait years after your white counterparts to get an opportunity like Jackie Robinson. You might lose what you worked for if you stick to your moral conviction like Muhammad Ali. You might have to fight for equal pay like Serena Williams. You might be told to shut up and do your job like LeBron James. You might be blackballed if you peacefully make your point like Colin Kaepernick. The sport the country loves the most may not always love you back. You'll turn on the TV and see people who don't know you stereotype you. Don't listen. Nelson Mandela said, "Sport has the power to change." Many people sacrifice medals and money so race wouldn't be as big a factor in your future as it was in their past. You can decide to play and be more than an athlete. Know that you are black. You're the dream of a slave. You're the product of the sacrifice of immigrants, which means you stand on the shoulders of giants. You're my legacy. The powerful legacy of sports has changed my life. I'm hoping its power gives you a better life, and that this is a movement and not just a moment. Love, Dad. So I'm joined now by two men who feature prominently in that piece and who I consider to be thought leaders on race in sport, Donnovan Bailey and Akeem Alou. Donnovan, you're the elder statesman, so let's start with you. All right, yes, let's go. The real Donnovan that Canada wants to see is not me. They're tired of my face. It's that beautiful face. Donnovan Bailey, thank you so much for joining. And if we're going to have a real, truthful conversation, then you have to be a part of it. And you started a while ago, in '96. You weren't just winning gold medals, you talked about race and maybe the fact that Canadians who aren't born here aren't treated the same. Why were you compelled to speak then, and what was the consequence of speaking?
Well, first of all, DJ, thanks for having me on. It's always good. Got lots of time for you, my friend. You know what? 25 years ago, I was the #1 sprinter on the planet. And I felt that, and the fact is, I've always been honest. That's number one. And I was asked a question. I was asked a question about. I was training at the time at University of Texas. And I was asked at the time about Canada and racism and American racism, and I guess a lot of people didn't like my answer. It's still my answer today. It's 25 years later, but I got blackballed. A whole lot of bad things were said about me then. But what's amazing about today is that we're actually having a conversation, and the people that should have listened then. Hopefully they're listening now, and we can make some changes and get some things done.
Well, I think you've been proven right, because we are still having the conversation, and I've got this fear of having that talk with my son. That's theoretical for me, but that's real for you. You don't want your son to be a trending name because he died. It's because of how he lived his life. What are those conversations like that you're having with him in this moment?
Well, number one, I mean, the thing is, as a parent, DJ, you know this. I knew the rules that my parents set for me. I mean, my dad's greatest pet peeve was loitering. So there was always rules that he set for his kids. And the great thing about me also is that I grew up in Oakville, where my parents were community leaders, and also so my friends' parents and my parents all knew each other. So we really couldn't do a whole lot. But the conversation was always about you doing the right things. I mean, thank God we were surrounded by, sports and, church and school. And I also had a good group of guys I hung out with. And so the conversations I have with my own kids are the exact same. I mean, one, you probably need to choose the people that you hang out with, especially when they get older. Two, loitering is just not allowed. So if you're going to go to your friend's house, you're going there, it's sports, or even you're going inside to play video games. But there are lots of simple things that you have to tell your teenage boys especially. Because also, my experience is not the same as everybody else. Because also growing up in Oakville, I mean, because my parents were community leaders here, or community organizers, when the policemen came by, if they're driving by and they see us playing basketball or road hockey, they'd actually stop and say hi. So we actually knew them. So I'm just saying to you that what's crazy, however, is that when I speak to my friends that grew up in inner city, it's a completely different story. People are scared. There's all kinds of tactics that are used to intimidate young kids. So these kids grow up, feeling they're less than, and all of that has to stop. The fact that in 2020, human beings get to watch another human being take a human being's life is absurd. And anyone who has seen the latest video of the latest black man to get snuffed out and obviously don't have a negative reaction, they don't need to be part of my society.
Canadians loved cheering for your races. Now they're learning from you about race. Thank you, DB. All right, you can't have a conversation about racism in this country without some truth and reconciliation, and that means the sport of hockey, and that means Akeem Alou. Akeem, thank you so much for joining and being a part of this conversation. You felt racism, and let's talk about it for the sports fans and also people who aren't as familiar with your story. How did racism present itself in your hockey career?
I feel like it started right from the beginning. I mean, my upbringings are a little bit different than people in Canada are accustomed to. Obviously, I came here at 9 years old, and our family didn't have much. I mean, I spent some years on welfare and with government assistance. So, I mean, I started feeling like I was different at a pretty early stage, obviously, socially, economically. And then I obviously started to try to get into the game because that's what everybody was doing in Canada. It's just a way of life. And obviously right away you start feeling a little different. You don't have the same, the best equipment that some kids have. You obviously don't have the best car. We didn't have a car for a long time. I was taking public transportation to games. So I started hearing obviously slurs right away. Obviously that you're not welcome in our game, and stick to basketball, those things. As I got older, I picked up the game pretty quick. So I moved up levels at a rapid pace. And I don't know if that's when kind of jealousy took over, maybe from other kids or parents. But then that's when you start hearing the really bad stuff, like the N-words and stuff like that, which happened to me at an early age in a tournament in Quebec. And then moving into minor hockey, obviously a lot of people know about my situation in Windsor. And I feel that there was race involved in that. And then obviously turning professional. People know about my story with Bill Peters in Rockford. and just always just being told that you're different, you look different, you speak different, your hair is different. Things like cut your hair, you won't get called up to the NHL. And it was just always things that I couldn't control that were holding me back. And that's kind of what hurt me a lot throughout my career.
And I can't let you go without you talking about what you're doing to try and help. You started the Alliance for Diversity with 6 other black players. What are you trying to accomplish with that initiative?
Well, I feel like with the guys we have in our core group right now, we'll definitely be adding. There's nobody better to speak on the issues of race in our game. Just a fun fact: we have 4,500 NHL games played in this group, and we've all dealt with something of some sort. So we feel like we're great. We're a great group to begin this conversation with. What we're trying to do is get into the grassroots. I feel like that's where it all starts, and obviously that hits close to home with me. Without the help of minor hockey organizations, gear and registration, I wouldn't have been able to make it to the National Hockey League or play hockey at any sort of competitive level. So for me, that's near and dear to my heart to help kids, because I feel like kids get eliminated right off the bat with costs that are associated with hockey. And the other thing is I feel like it's super important, and what we're going to try to do is to bring some personality into this game. I don't think it should matter what kind of hair you have, what kind of tattoos you have, what kind of music listen to. I think that should be something that's a positive, to have different minds thinking in different ways, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think for a long time that hockey's looked at as a white person sport and an old boys club, and I feel like that they wanted to keep it that way. And I think that's what's holding hockey back. And obviously there's reasons why you can't compare hockey to soccer, basketball, the NFL even, and it's because there's that lack of personality and the lack of trying to be different. Hockey's a machine, and people just try to fit into that mold. I tell everyone I think hockey's the best game in the world, but it also has the most potential in the world to be that much greater. So that's some of our initiatives that we're working on.
You're a better man than me. If I had that racist treatment, I would be bitter. You're making the game better. Thank you. I salute you.
Thank you, sir. I really appreciate you having me, and you're doing amazing work out here, fighting for us, fighting for the right cause, and you have our backs, and we have yours, and I got all the time in the world for you, pal.
Stop trying to skirt the issue. Stop trying to change the subject. Right now, we need to be all on the same footing.
The people that have the power need to start listening. They need to step forward. They need to start making changes, or else society is going to continue to be in a fractured state.
It doesn't matter how woke you think you are, you still have learning to do.
There's a lot of things we've learned already that we had no idea about.
You can no longer stay silent. Which side are you on?
One of the very first words I heard was negro, right? No, and the connotations.
Whitening. When black is not beautiful, anti-blackness and racism persists in the Filipino community, the century-old ideals oppressing its own members, putting a wedge between themselves and the black community.
To better understand why these damaging attitudes persist, I need to take you to a city that has the largest number of Filipinos per capita in the country.
Del Bautista grew up in Winnipeg's Northwest. He's my cousin, and in the 80s, he was the only Filipino kid at school until a wave of families moved in. They played basketball, listened to hip-hop, and watched House Party. But the love of black culture was contrasted against the attitudes of an older generation at home.
To kiss my grandma goodbye before baseball, and she'd say, "Oh, you're so dark." Or going out to the park and my whole family being in the shade.
It only makes sense to protect black people as much as you can. If you want to be adjacent to their culture, if you want allyship.
The anti-black perceptions come from Spanish and American rule.
What's been called colorism, colonial ideas about what is beautiful, what is ideal. It's also related, of course, to ideas around class positioning. So if you're out in the sun too long, it's probably because you work out in the field.
And he's like, well, if you're Asian, we can't be friends anymore. And so all our classmates started
calling him a racist.
Hope Berena says her 11-year-old Isabel just learned about racism after an incident at school she suspects is related to COVID-19 discrimination. Then
articles made me realize that my friends who are black and my cousins who are black, they don't have the same rights as me.
When the Black Lives Matter event approached, Isabel was determined to go.
Berena says more people should look at the issue through a child's eyes.
They're just kids and they're saying, you can't talk about other people's skin. How long it takes for us to think before we even say these things out loud. That's a learned behavior that we've picked up. I think we can all really learn from the kids.
In Calgary, Crystal Adaris, City News.
Welcome back. We're now joined by Orlando Bowen, former victim and current motivational speaker. Orlando, 10 years ago, you thought you were going to die, jumped by plainclothes officers, savagely beaten, and that was just the beginning. You also suffered injustices in the court system. So can you give us a rundown of what happened there?
Well, I mean, it happened at a time where I was very active in community and serving and going into schools with police services to encourage young people to stand up for the right thing and to do what we could to make a difference, working with sick youth and homeless youth. And I was assaulted by 2 plainclothes officers. And again, I worked with amazing officers at the time and still do to this day. The first challenge was the assault. Right? And then I think the bigger challenge was the fact that when they found out that I was actively involved in making a difference and working alongside them, a huge cover-up began where I was taken to jail. They went back to the scene where my vehicle was, planted drugs at the scene, and then charged me with assault, 2 counts, and possession of a controlled substance. So it was a crazy, crazy journey.
So we can't all, like you, make our message and eventually become motivational speakers. I'm not that compelling. But what can we do? Give us some tangible actions that people who are in similar situations can do to help.
Well, I mean, it's a journey, and every situation is unique. Well, you know, one of the things as we journeyed through the whole process, we were looking at, you know, first we had to find representation, people who were lawyers who were willing to go up against the system. And not many were. Some were afraid. Some encouraged me to plead guilty to a lesser charge because they didn't want to deal with the system in its entirety. But we found representation that was willing to go to battle. And yeah, I remember them saying that they hope that we get a good judge. And I thought, what does a good judge have to do with this? And they said, well, it's not so much about the truth, but it's what is believed to be the truth. And again, I was challenged by that thought because my understanding was that we could seek justice through the justice system, but it doesn't always work that way for everyone, which is what we became very well aware of. Now, as we were journeying, the arresting officer, in my case, was himself arrested by the RCMP for trafficking cocaine. And you know, when he was arrested, he ended up being convicted and sentenced to prison, and people wanted to celebrate. And but you know, my response was, we can't celebrate that because he's a father going off to prison, and we know what that could do to families, and he's a human being like I am. So we have to do what we can in order to use whatever we have. Sometimes it's painful, sometimes, you know, it's blissful, but to use what we have in order to make a difference, not necessarily for us, but for those that come after us, and that's been our commitment ever since.
Orlando, we're very inspired by your story. It's incredible, and thank you for that. We could talk to you for a full hour for sure, but we're out of time. We're going to check in for a final time with Mel now.
We've been bringing you excerpts from a poll all about racism. It was done for Rogers Sports and Media by Abacus Data. And our poll also asked Canadians whether they think certain groups experience racism as part of their everyday lives. For example, we asked, how often do Black people experience racism in the following situations? 88% when it comes to police treatment, 84% in the job market, and when it comes to advancement, 78%. If you'd like a closer look at this poll, you can find all the details on our website, citynews.ca.
I'm inviting entrepreneur Wes Hall in now, who founded Kingsdale Advisors. Now, Wes, you left Bay Street and built your own empire. We just revealed poll results where people say they believe Blacks are discriminated against in the workplace and when it comes to job advancement. This was your experience. So what could your workplace have done to keep you?
Well, I keep using the term systemic racism, and in a lot of cases, these companies are not outright saying that we don't want Black people in certain positions. And the analogy that I use is a situation where there was a lack of female representation in the boardrooms and also in the C-suites. And what has happened is that that was identified, and there was a process put in place to actually address the issue. It's called the 30% Club. And what the aim is that they would have gender parity in the boardroom, but for a certain period of time, which is 2023, the expectation is that they would have at least 30% of female representation in boardrooms and also in the C-suite. So when we set up the initiative with respect to the Black North Initiative, it's really with the same aim, whereby we will have a certain percentage of Blacks in the C-suite and also on boards, but that will happen over a period of time, similar to the 30% Club.
So let's talk about money instead of morals. We know that there are only 4 Black CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, one of which is a female. But we also know that Fortune 500 companies perform better when they have a diverse workforce. So how can companies make the tangible steps to perform better by becoming more diverse?
Yeah, listen, I'm from Jamaica, right? I'm from a small town called St. Thomas, and if I set up a company and I go into my small town and I get all my buddies to be on the board and run the company with me, I'm not going to get very far in that company. I may expand outside of the town, but I probably won't expand outside of Jamaica. And so if you really want true diversity, you're going to look far and wide to be able to get talent to help you to deal with the future growth of your business. So that's what we're really encouraging people to do, to say, if you have not only diversity of thoughts, diversity of culture, diversity of gender, and so on, you're probably going to have people at the boardroom table and in the C-suite that's going to be able to think through issues. For example, through this pandemic, if you didn't have people who thought differently around you to manage through this pandemic, a lot of companies just won't survive. And so when you have people thinking differently, coming up with ideas, creative ideas, maybe because of their lived experiences, chances are you're going to have a much more successful company, and that's going to go straight to the bottom line.
So as we continue the conversation, are you optimistic? Do you think things are changing?
I'm absolutely optimistic. So today we launched the Canadian Council of Business Leaders Against Anti-Black Racism, Systemic Racism. And we put out a press release this morning, and we have a number of individuals who actually put their hand up very, very high. Victor Dodig, the CEO of CIBC. We have Prem Watsa, who is the CEO of Fairfax Financial. And we have Rola Dacker, who is the CEO of Cisco Canada. And quite frankly, we announced this initiative this morning, and what we want is CEOs across Canada to sign up for a pledge to say, we are committed to ending anti-Black systemic racism. And if you look at the press release, those are strong languages that we use, that our goal is to end it here in Canada, meaning that we need to have representation of Blacks in C-suites, we need to have representations of Blacks in the boardrooms. In addition to that, we need to do things for the community as well. And within an hour of us sending out that information, that invitation, and we're going to have a town hall on July 20th, within an hour, we got 74 companies, large companies that signed up to say, we're on board. And a lot of them didn't ask questions. They go, we're on board, and we're here to change the conversation.
Thank you so much, Wes. You really got to write down those goals and make sure you hit them. Thanks for all that information.
From us, thank you for watching Ending Racism, What Will It Take? We hope that it's given you the chance to reflect on racism in Canada and beyond, but also inspired you to take action in your community.
Listen, we focused a lot on the Black Lives Matter movement, but we all know racism is an issue that impacts people from several different cultures and backgrounds. Islamophobia, discrimination against Asian and Indigenous communities, just a few forms of bigotry that are still running rampant in Canadian society.
this can just be a moment in our history, or it can be history making. When people stop taking the streets in protest of police violence, or when the media moves on to the next big story, will you still be fighting for change?
We will be, and we have been, and we hope that you will be too. Thanks so much for watching and learning with us tonight. Have a good night.